So Angela Williamson is the CEO of the Blue Economy CRC, so a new CEO, congratulations. She's a senior leader who brings over 2 decades experience working at the forefront of sustainable oceans governance, planning and policy across government, political offices, the private sector and research. And is the co-designer of the National Futures of Seafood study, which many of you will be aware of and potentially have participated in. And she's also an inaugural leader of Australia's support for the Coral Triangle Initiative. Angie's goal is to grow the ocean economy by elevating the role of sustainable food systems and integrated ocean governance. So welcome, Ange, I'll hand it over to you.
Oh, thank you. Can you see it?
Yeah,
fantastic. Good. Sorry, I always have to check that because you never know, especially when you have multiple screens. But thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate this opportunity. Some of you may have participated in our recent Futures of Seafood webinar where we were taking everyone through our roadmap, which is the outcome part of the outcome of that 2-year project. And what I'm going to do is give you an aquaculture version of that as we go along. I think it's a really neat way to understand how we're looking at aquaculture within that national context, some of those drivers and challenges. And what I really want to do is share some of those WA perspectives as we go along. I'll put a prompter out there for you to have a think about particular questions moving forward. One of the key things that Futures of Seafood has done compared to, let's say, ABARES and how a lot of other research or government reporting goes on is, in addition to national production value, we made a decision to go further. And in particular, look at where GVP has been understated, that real economic footprint. And it's a really important piece if you're looking at investing or understanding market or understanding who your consumers are more broadly. So the ABARES GVP figure, it basically measures value to the farm gate or the boat ramp only. And we all are very aware that if you're vertically integrated or if you're thinking about the broader supply chain, that what producers receive at point of harvest only goes so far. So it deliberately excludes everything downstream, whether it's processing, cold chain logistics, wholesale distribution, that retail margin, food service, and the employment and household income that those activities generate. And it's really held back the conversation of where aquaculture and seafood fits within that Australian food system. Plus, also, I don't think it's necessarily provided the accurate figure when you are having conversations around a crowded ocean estate or around decisions being made in government. So we worked with BDO Economics to look at supply chain analysis, which was commissioned as part of this project. And what it did was it basically brought that whole complete economic footprint from production to consumer. And this is a really substantial amount. But also it demonstrates where the flow goes, who is consuming, and what those decisions could ultimately consequences be. On top of that, it's also allowed us to look at imports. 64% of seafood consumed in Australia is imported. And so there's a real opportunity there to address. Justin talked about white flesh fish. I think we're all chasing that unicorn. I think it's a really important part of the future of protein, marine-based or land-based protein from that perspective. But what you can see here is by moving into GDP, WA ends up in a $1.4 billion proposition, which is quite a substantial increase. This is across seafood more broadly. Under futures, there is also a breakdown for aquaculture and for wild, but understanding those wild markets as well as the aquaculture markets are really important, and looking at the substitution or ability to, from an additionality point, that aquaculture product could play a role in meeting those demands. What's been really interesting through this work is a lot of the consumption does still sit in WA, what you were producing. Exception here is like with Estepels, but a lot of the food-related aquaculture is WA-based, and then you move to Victoria and Queensland, and then lesser into the New South Wales space. But New South Wales plays a really important role in moving WA product out into the regions and into those other locations more broadly. But it hasn't necessarily led to a lot of consumption within that exact state per se. So something when you're thinking about growth opportunities, and I strongly encourage you, if you are on a holiday at any point or get a chance to go to the Sydney fish markets, please do it. It's going to be our mecca in many ways, and we really think it plays an important role in seafood literacy in the region and seafood literacy for tourists so that they really understand that iconic offering of seafood that we have here in Australia. One of the other parts of Futures of Seafood that I really wanted to emphasise for the WA audience, and in particular aquaculture, is the work undertaken by Beth Fulton at CSIRO. Beth recently presented to the Aqua Board. I think it was or was at the AGM, but I think it was a really important opportunity to understand a part of Futures, which was looking at those future forecasts, understanding what the state of play looks like today, and under those different scenarios, where aquaculture and wild could be. I think that there were some really specific outcomes there in the context of aquaculture that you could start thinking about now, thinking about what decisions you want to make off the back of that, not just in deciding what species you may want to look at bringing into the mix or amplifying and increasing, but also what your supply system looks like, the ability to get product in a safe way to your markets and consumers. One of the other things I thought was really interesting is that I'm going to be very generalist here, so please, I hope I'm not going over crossing any lines, but in Australia, there's a real interesting repositioning of aquaculture companies. We've gone from a lot of SMEs sitting in the middle to where we're sitting at the moment is a lot of micro and nanos and really quite large, significant multinationals. And those multinationals are growing through a variety of reasons. We've heard a lot about Tassal today already, and I would just sort of like to emphasize that they have this really amazing ability to optimize those margins by bringing in a much broader experience base and market base and negotiating power, and that's really changed some of the other aspects. But equally on the other side, your micros and nanos have something really unique to market, and they have something quite local and specific. And if you're looking in the EU, that shift that I'm talking about has already come into play in both wild as well as aquaculture, and it offers a provenance aspect in that local areas where you are growing or producing. It offers a state-based kind of deliverable, and then it has that national perspective as well more broadly. But I wanted to emphasize that SMEs are an area of caution more broadly across seafood in Australia at the moment. This system is not quite working exactly for that. And when you look at these future forecasts as well, there's some aspects there. So organisations like this peak, looking at co-op style shared infrastructure and resources might be a really important part to maintain SMEs moving forward. But I just wanted to highlight that. But more broadly, WA has some really unique aspects in the scenario modelling, some things that the other jurisdictions don't have, or maybe South Australia has to an extent. And so when I hear how you're looking at some of the unicorns, I'm like, yeah, that's great. That's what you need to start thinking about. You have an opportunity to really position yourselves as like a bit of a sleeping giant in the context of aquaculture more broadly. You have some really interesting sovereign autonomy within your regions. You have a corridor of export opportunities that mean you can get to other places quicker in the Asian markets. But on top of that, you've got a really rich and stable supply in state, which I think is really important. Just going to go through the Futures of Seafood roadmap at the highest level and really touch on, again, those aquaculture elements. There is a piece at the end of this where I'll give you some guidance on maybe if you would like to contribute to this, because it is open to public consultation at the moment. As I touched on with Beth's work, her scenarios, there really are 3 outcomes that we're facing at the moment with seafood across Australia. Interestingly, I would highlight that a lot of wild is probably leaning more towards that struggling, surviving. And what I would say with the aquaculture space is its starting point is really that borderline more of surviving and in some cases thriving. And thriving has a variety of different attributes around it. But one of the things I would really point to is aquaculture in Australia is growing based on optimization of existing space. It's not necessarily growing at this stage due to new space. If anything, the spatial squeeze, the delays in regulatory approvals, and in particular locations, unless you're in a regional area with quite local support, the ability to create new areas is quite limited. But on top of that, WA as well as a number of other governments have offered new spaces, but for a number of other reasons, they haven't actually been achieved or turned into a commercial entity, or you've had commercial setbacks in that process, or the pace and lead and lag between government policy, market and industry, and capex and investor certainty hasn't quite got there yet. But the reason I really wanted to emphasize these three is I encourage you to have a think about where you sit, maybe as a company, or maybe as a jurisdiction, or maybe as a sector within these, because this will give you some different guidance on how to move through and navigate these, because ultimately Futures of Seafood is looking to guarantee a pathway from moving from struggling to surviving and ultimately thriving. And that's going to rely on action from investors, government, market, and industry itself. It's not a straight path, I would really want to emphasize. And on pathway, this is really acknowledging that there is a broader national inflection point when it comes to the production of seafood and our seafood systems. If I was going to, from a national perspective, talk about marine finfish in water, there is only 4 CEOs in Australia who are responsible for all of the marine finfish production. And so when you have 8 government processes within all those jurisdictions, and you have a variety of research and other aspects, I'm going to go out there and say that I'm not quite sure our system and our industry and our research and everything is quite fit for purpose for who we are today and who we wish to be tomorrow. So I think there's going to be quite a bit of work going on in this space, and Futures will definitely be having those conversations as we look to stabilise the seafood environment, the markets, the consumers, the investors, but then also, and the governance, but then also look to transition. And in that, one of the things that's come out is like scaling up aquaculture, that scalable pathway that's been enabled, noting that alongside you've got to build in further wild catch resilience, and as you move towards that thriving state. Futures of Seafood sets out 5 national reform priorities. If I'm aquaculture and I'm looking at those, that first one sits around National Seafood Guarantee. This is about a national objective to ensure that Australians will be able to consume, grow, farm, catch seafood, Australian seafood. This is off the back of a lot of decisions being made across all jurisdictions that might make you think that maybe seafood is not a priority and Australian seafood is not a priority. And that 64 import I touched on moves into that 90-10 ratio you see over in the US. This is around secure access and tenure, the ability to have more productive or investor-friendly systems that sit around and behind leases that allow you to capture additional investment, but equally to be able to look at things like hatcheries and RAS and other, key fundamental elements. Industry unity, I won't touch on this too much, but ultimately 280 bodies across Australian seafood, and sometimes that voice gets lost. There is also an opportunity to harmonise unity and other options in that space. Seafood amplification, opportunity to look at those markets, consumer trust, transparency, the narratives, that public education, and deal with misinformation responses. National rapid response capability. I'm sure everyone's been watching the HAB in South Australia and looking at a very static estate and how that estate might become, that farming estate might be able to have corridors of movement and transition and buffer areas that might have insurance considerations as you go along, and also have kit down the bottom that allows for, I'm talking grids, that allows for gear movement and mobility during those kinds of environments, as an example of a national rapid response capability. And optimization of R&D. Again, a lot of jurisdictions, there's a lot of duplication if you take it from a national perspective, and I appreciate that calamari in one location might be different to calamari in another, but at the same time, how can we make a better and deliver better outcomes and honour those principles around if there is less money coming in, how we can still support adequately innovation, R&D. I'll give you an example there for me. I'm working on the first aquaculture research trial in Commonwealth waters. That's a $20 million build and research plan. Off the back of that, we've got an additional 30 million in kind between Australia and New Zealand, looking to really advance that open aquaculture opportunity with benefits right around Australia and New Zealand, with the ability to create a trans-Tasman system so that we are learning off one another and that we're optimising that $50 million associated with that particular activity. Sitting behind aquaculture as well as wild, but I'm going to really emphasize aquaculture as well as government decision making, is data infrastructure, it's knowledge, it's the tools, it's the systems. AI plays such an important role. What's sitting behind that is a wealth of knowledge and information that allows you to increase your productivity, to make decisions around feed and when you're feeding, or other factors like that, or how to deal with jellies, or how to deal with different temperatures, and so the oxygenation aspects. So understanding and having that system around it, whether you are industry, government, or even from that research perspective, so we don't keep repeating and tripping over ourselves, is crucial. Products, tools, systems, and ultimately what we're trying to develop as well is an impact statement. So when decisions are made in other agencies that impact the likely production of seafood, whether that reduces or increases, that is a conversation around the cabinet table. Series of actions on that roadmap, strongly encourage you to look into them. The roadmap itself sets out a whole series of expectations that we are, or invitations, areas of invite that we're putting out to government and industry and research and investors as we move forward. But as I said, it's draft at the moment. So I encourage you to jump on our website, download these documents, have a look, jump into this, have your say, provide your feedback. It is a 57-page document. Do not be frightened. You can keep moving through it. You don't have to answer all 57 questions. But that's me.
Great, thank you, Ange. We've definitely gone over time, but I didn't want to jump in because I was interested in what was coming. So
just trying to talk fast.
we fit a lot in, so thank you. There is a question in the chat, but we'll come back to it at Q&A. And I will pop a link to Futures of Seafood into the chat shortly.